This story is a fictional narrative set in the 19th century American South. It deals with sensitive subjects including slavery, power abuse, and psychological horror. The characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and are used to explore the moral decay born of domination, betrayal, and vengeance. Viewer discretion is advised. The story is intended for mature audiences and should be seen as a cautionary reflection on cruelty, justice, and human darkness. The sun hung heavy over Moorfield Plantation, casting long golden ribbons across fields of sugarcane that whispered under the southern wind. The estate stretched far beyond sight, hundreds of acres of labor, pain, and silent endurance. To outsiders, Moorfield was a symbol of prosperity and dignity. To those who toiled under its heat, it was a living prison. At its center stood the Grand Mansion, a white-columned structure with high windows and a bell that rang every dawn to summon the enslaved to work. The walls gleamed, yet inside they carried echoes of screams and the muffled sobs of people who were never free. Mr. Elijah Moore, the plantation's master, was known for his charm. His name was whispered with both fear and admiration throughout the county. He was handsome, articulate, and dangerously persuasive, the kind of man who could make cruelty sound like divine order. When he smiled, people felt compelled to trust him. When he spoke, they dared not disagree. Beside him stood Margaret Moore, his wife, a woman of quiet elegance and deep restraint. She was the daughter of a reverend, raised in the principles of piety, devotion, and duty. Her beauty was once spoken of as the finest in the parish, her kindness as unshakable. But years within Moorfield had turned her gentle nature into silence. Her eyes no longer reflected hope. They carried the calm of a lake just before a storm. Each morning, Margaret would sit by the upper veranda, reading her worn Bible as the workers lined up in the fields below. Her gaze would follow the bent backs and trembling hands that cut cane under the overseer's whip. She said nothing, but deep within, guilt gnawed at her heart. She had inherited her husband's wealth and his sins. At dinner, Elijah would speak of politics, cotton, and profit while servants stood by the walls like statues. He treated them as shadows, existing only to refill his glass or carry away his plates. Margaret often wanted to speak, to question him, to challenge his coldness, but she knew how swiftly his anger could turn. There were rumors whispered by the maids, that Elijah held strange gatherings after midnight, that he visited the slave quarters under the cover of fog. Some said he sought pleasure. Others said he sought something darker. Forbidden rituals whispered from the coast, promises of eternal youth and fortune made with the blood of the oppressed. Margaret dismissed such stories at first. But one evening, while walking through the hallway, she noticed mud-stained footprints leading from the servants' entrance to Elijah's study. The air was heavy with sweat and smoke. She heard muffled laughter, deep, masculine voices not belonging to her husband's usual guests. When she entered, the room was empty, the curtains fluttering as if the night itself had just fled. The next day, Elijah was unusually kind. He sent her flowers, dined early, and spoke softly, as though trying to erase something unseen. But the unease stayed. Moorfield Plantation was a kingdom built on appearances, and Margaret knew it. The Sunday sermons Elijah funded, the charity galas he hosted for the church, the donations he made to local schools, all of it was a mask. Behind the southern charm lay a rot so deep that even the house seemed to breathe it. Sometimes, at night, Margaret would wake to hear the faint humming of the enslaved in the distant fields. It was not sorrow she heard anymore. It was power, restrained yet rising, a pulse that carried through the ground beneath her bed. And for the first time she began to feel afraid, not of her husband, but of what might happen when the silence finally broke. She didn't yet know that soon she would witness the breaking herself, in a moment so horrifying that it would unravel every illusion of decency she had ever clung to. Because within Moorfield's perfect facade, something monstrous was festering. And when it surfaced, it would drag not only Elijah but the entire town into a spectacle of vengeance they would never forget. The plantation's pride was about to rot from within, and Margaret's awakening would begin with one forbidden discovery. The morning began like any other, Still air, buzzing cicadas, and the faint scent of magnolia drifting through the open halls of Moorfield. Margaret had been gone for several days, visiting her ailing sister in Charleston. Her carriage arrived unannounced, the wheels crunching over the gravel driveway as the house came into view, glowing in the midday sun. She expected the staff to rush out as they always did, nervous and polite. But the yard was oddly still. The horses stirred uneasily, and from somewhere distant came a sound, laughter sharp and hushed, echoing faintly from the back of the house. Margaret dismissed the coachman and entered through the front door. The house smelled different, heavier, almost sweet and sickly, like wine left too long in the glass. The piano in the parlor was open, a half-empty decanter sat on the sideboard, and a man's coat, Elijah's, was draped carelessly over the chair. Something twisted in her stomach. Elijah was never careless. She ascended the staircase slowly, her hand trailing the banister polished to a mirror shine. As she reached the landing, faint voices drifted from behind the master bedroom door. Low tones, the creak of movement, a moan that froze her mid-step. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle, pausing only when a soft thud echoed within, followed by a laugh that did not belong to her husband alone. She pushed the door open. The scene inside shattered her world in an instant. Elijah lay sprawled across the bed, his body glistening with sweat, his face flushed and wild. Around him were three men, slaves she recognized from the fields, their bodies tangled with his, their expressions a mix of fear and exhaustion. The air was thick with shame, incense, and the faint metallic tang of candle smoke. For a long, stunned moment, no one moved. The men froze like statues, eyes wide, muscles tightening as if expecting a whip to fall from the heavens. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. Then he stood, frantic, grabbing for his trousers, words tumbling from his mouth. Excuses, lies, anything. Margaret, it's not. She raised her hand. Not in anger, but silence. Her heart thudded so loud she could barely hear. The men backed away, heads bowed, trembling. They were not partners in sin. They were prisoners in a moment they never wanted. She could see it in their faces. Fear so raw it almost hurt to look at. Elijah tried to approach her, but she stepped back. The look in her eyes stopped him cold. Not fury, not sorrow, but something deeper, something final. In that moment, she saw her husband for what he truly was. Not merely adulterous, not merely cruel, but corrupted to the core, feeding on power, bending both race and faith to his own appetite. The walls of Moorfield seemed to pulse, breathing with the heat of their disgrace. The candles flickered violently, their flames bending toward her as though even the light wanted to expose the darkness that had been hidden there. Without a word, she turned and walked away. Her steps echoed through the halls like distant thunder. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only moved, slow, deliberate, unshakable. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed mercilessly, yet the air felt colder than before. Margaret crossed the veranda, staring at the endless fields, hundreds of men and women laboring under the sun, oblivious to the storm that had just begun. That night, she locked herself in her chambers. No one dared disturb her. Servants whispered that they saw her pacing until dawn, whispering prayers that didn't sound like prayers at all. On the third night, she left her room and walked barefoot into the fields. The slaves watched silently as she passed, her white nightgown brushing against the cane, her eyes hollow, her voice barely a whisper as she asked one of the older women, "Do you know how to make a soul remember what it's done?" The woman said nothing, but nodded slowly. That was the night the songs changed. The field songs, once mournful and slow, took on a new rhythm, deep and pulsing like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Margaret listened from her window, her face pale in the moonlight. The woman who had once prayed for mercy now prayed for revelation. The wife who had once believed in salvation now desired justice. Not divine, but human, brutal, and unforgettable. She would not scream at her husband. She would not leave him. She would make him face what he had done, and she would make the entire town watch. What began as betrayal was about to turn into judgment. And Moorfield Plantation, once the symbol of grace and order, would soon become a theater of vengeance. The storm had been born, and its eye was Margaret Moore. The days after the discovery passed in an eerie stillness. The house, once filled with the sound of Elijah's booming laughter and the shuffle of servants, became a hollow shell. The plantation air thickened with unspoken fear. Margaret spoke to no one. Elijah, too ashamed to face the world yet too proud to hide, pretended nothing had happened. He would still sit at the breakfast table every morning, pretending to read the paper, sipping his coffee as though his wife's silence was just another one of her moods. But beneath the surface, both of them were unraveling. Margaret spent her hours in the old library, a forgotten room near the east wing. Dust clung to the shelves. The air smelled of mold and parchment. It was there she found the old journals, records from the plantation's first owner, a man named Jonathan Hale, written more than a century ago. His handwriting spoke of rituals, strange ceremonies performed by the enslaved people in the cane fields at night, rites of resistance disguised as songs. He called them the hymns of fire and blood. Margaret read every word. She read until her fingers were black with dust and her eyes burned from candlelight. There were mentions of justice through suffering, purification through pain, and the soil remembering sin. The words unsettled her, but she couldn't look away. That night, she dreamed of Elijah standing in the middle of the fields, bound and burning while 1,000 eyes watched. The hymn rose louder and louder, a deep, rumbling chant that made her heart race. When she woke, her nightgown was soaked with sweat, but her mind was clear. It was time to act. She began with small things. The servants noticed her visiting the quarters at odd hours, speaking quietly with the older women who carried stories in their bones, knowledge passed down from ancestors brought over the sea in chains. They taught her of roots, herbs, oils that could draw out truth, and powders that could numb a man's will. Elijah grew suspicious, but his pride blinded him. He believed Margaret was broken, humiliated beyond repair. In his arrogance, he thought her silence meant surrender. He didn't notice that the eyes of his slaves no longer looked away when he passed. They watched him now openly, unafraid. Something had changed in the air. The weather mirrored the tension. Days grew darker earlier, and thunderstorms rolled over the plantation almost every evening. The rain came heavy, drowning the fields in mud. Workers whispered that the sky itself had turned against the master. Margaret stayed mostly in her room, but sometimes she stood on the veranda, staring into the storm with an expression no one could read. She didn't speak of what she was planning, but the servants sensed it. Something sacred and dangerous was approaching. One afternoon, she called the housekeeper Martha, a woman who had lived on the plantation since birth. Margaret spoke softly. "Tell them to be ready. When the bell rings after dusk, I want everyone, every man, woman, and child, to gather in the barn. And tell them to bring the hymn." Martha stared at her, eyes wide with both fear and awe. She nodded without a word. That evening, Margaret went to Elijah's study. He was drunk, staring at the fire, lost in his own guilt and arrogance. Without meeting his eyes, she said, "Tomorrow night, I'm holding a gathering. The town will attend. You will be there." Elijah laughed bitterly. "A gathering? After what you've done to this household with your silence? My dear, you'll make quite the spectacle." Her voice was calm, almost serene. "Yes," she replied. "That's exactly what I intend to make." Elijah didn't realize then that he had already become her spectacle. The next day, invitations were sent to the townsfolk, the pastor, the sheriff, and every neighboring family. The message was simple and strangely polite. "You are cordially invited to an evening of truth and repentance at Moorfield Plantation. Attendance is expected." The town buzzed with gossip. Some believed Margaret had gone mad. Others whispered she had found religion. But curiosity outweighed fear. That night, Margaret walked through the darkened hallways, the candlelight trembling in her hand. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her pass. Ancestors with cold eyes, men who had built empires on blood. She paused before one painting of Elijah's father, a stern man in a black suit. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the cracked varnish. "You built this house on cruelty," she whispered. "Let it end the same way." Outside, thunder growled like a warning. The cane fields swayed under the wind, their tips slicing through the dark like knives. The hymn began, low, slow, distant, rising from the quarters, carried by the storm. Margaret closed her eyes and let the sound fill her. It was no longer sorrowful. It was commanding. By the time dawn arrived, the invitations had reached every corner of the county. The stage was set. In one day's time, the walls of Moorfield would echo with screams, truth, and judgment. The quiet before the storm was almost over, and Margaret Moore was no longer the master's wife. She was the voice of reckoning. The morning of the gathering dawned strangely calm. After days of storms, the sky was washed in an eerie gray stillness. The air felt too heavy, too quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Word had spread faster than wildfire. By noon, carriages began arriving from the nearby town. Curious townsfolk dressed in Sunday best, stepping cautiously onto the red clay driveway of Moorfield Plantation. They whispered among themselves, their voices low and nervous. No one understood what an evening of truth and repentance truly meant, but no one dared ignore an invitation from the Moors. The mansion stood like a pale ghost in the distance, its windows dark, its shutters closed. Servants guided the guests toward the barn, which had been cleared of equipment and lined with torches that flickered against the wooden walls. Long benches were placed in rows like pews in a chapel. At the far end stood a raised platform draped in white linen, simple, elegant, and strangely solemn. Margaret oversaw everything in silence. Dressed in black silk, her face veiled, she moved through the preparations like a conductor among musicians, her gestures calm but commanding. Her presence carried weight. The servants followed her wordlessly, afraid yet compelled, sensing that this night would change everything. Elijah had not yet appeared. He spent the day in his study, pacing like a caged animal, his nerves fraying with every passing hour. The strange confidence he once carried had begun to crack. He knew Margaret was capable of cruelty when wronged, but this was beyond his understanding. By sunset, the fields glowed with the fading gold of dying light. The cane rustled in the wind like restless spirits. The barn filled slowly. Townsfolk took their seats, exchanging nervous glances. The local pastor sat near the front, clutching his Bible, unsure whether to expect a sermon or a scandal. Then the bell rang, a single low toll that echoed across the fields, deep and heavy, vibrating through the earth. From the shadows, the enslaved workers began to enter. They didn't sit with the guests. They stood along the walls, silent, still, their eyes fixed on the empty platform. Each of them held a small candle. The flickering lights filled the barn with a strange, trembling glow. Moments later, Margaret entered. Every head turned. Her veil shimmered faintly in the torchlight, her steps slow, deliberate. She stopped at the front of the platform, turned toward the crowd, and spoke softly. "Tonight truth will speak. No preacher, no lawman, and no lie will silence it." The words fell like stones into the silence. Then, two servants emerged from the shadows, dragging something behind them. A man, disheveled, bound by rope. Elijah Moore. Gasps filled the barn. The once proud master of Moorfield, the man who commanded hundreds, now stood barefoot and trembling before his own people. His shirt was torn, his hair wild, his eyes full of confusion and fear. "Margaret!" he shouted, voice cracking. "What is this madness? You shame yourself before everyone." Margaret's voice was steady. "No, Elijah. It's you who shamed yourself and all of us. This house, these fields, this town. All of it built on your sin." The pastor rose to speak, but she silenced him with a glance so sharp he froze mid-sentence. She turned to the crowd. "You all knew. You saw the bruises. You heard the cries. You ignored them because it was easier to look away. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. The truth in her words stung. Margaret stepped closer to Elijah, her voice low but echoing. I gave you years of silence, years of obedience. You repaid it with filth, with cruelty beyond what God himself would forgive. But tonight, Elijah, you will answer. Not to me, but to every soul you broke. She raised her hand. At her signal, the enslaved workers began to hum. A slow, deep rhythm that seemed to come from the ground itself. It wasn't a song of sorrow. It was old, older than the land. A hymn of remembrance and power. Elijah screamed, "Stop this! You'll bring ruin to us all." But the humming grew louder, swelling like a storm tide. The candles flickered violently, and the crowd pressed back, uneasy but unable to leave. Margaret reached beneath the platform and lifted a whip. His whip, the same one he'd used for years to mark skin and crush will. She held it up to the torchlight, and its shadow stretched long across the barn wall like a serpent. Elijah Moore, she said softly, tonight, the pain you gave returns to you. Every lash, every scar, every cry, all remembered. The humming shifted to a chant. The old women in the crowd began to sway, whispering words in a tongue no one recognized. The air thickened. The temperature dropped. Even the torches burned dim. Elijah struggled, screaming for mercy. His words drowned beneath the voices rising around him. Margaret's hand trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of what was to come. The pastor fell to his knees, clutching his Bible. The townsfolk cried out, demanding she stop, but none dared step forward. And then silence. Margaret lowered the whip. Her voice was almost a whisper. Tomorrow, you'll see what repentance truly means. She turned to the townsfolk, her eyes cold, almost shining. You will all witness the truth you helped bury. The crowd began to disperse slowly, frightened and confused. The enslaved people remained behind, their candles still burning. Margaret looked at them and said softly, "Tomorrow night, the fields will remember." As the last of the guests left, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Elijah collapsed on the floor, gasping, eyes wild with terror. Margaret looked down at him, not with hatred, but with something far more terrifying, calm. The next day, the sun rose blood-red over the cane fields. The sky bruised with violet clouds that looked like they were watching, waiting. Word of the previous night's gathering spread like wildfire through the county. No one could speak of anything else. By noon, crowds began forming along the dirt road leading to Moorfield Plantation. Men in coats, women clutching parasols, children perched on fences, all whispering rumors. Some said Elijah Moore had lost his mind. Others claimed his wife had fallen under witchcraft. But curiosity burned brighter than fear. Margaret had ordered the fields cleared that morning. Workers, townsfolk, even the pastor, were instructed to gather near the old whipping post. The same post that had stood at the edge of the cane for decades, soaked with the sweat and blood of those who had been punished unjustly. Now, for the first time, it would see justice. Elijah had spent the night locked in his study under guard. He hadn't slept. His eyes were hollow, his voice hoarse from pleading. Every sound, every footstep, every creak in the hallway made him flinch. He tried to pray, but the words stuck in his throat. As the clock struck noon, the guards, two men who had once trembled at his orders, dragged him outside. The sun hit him like fire. His white shirt was torn, his wrists bound. He stumbled as they pulled him through the field toward the waiting crowd. When the people saw him, a hush fell. Even the wind seemed to stop. Margaret stood near the post, dressed in white now. Not as a widow, not as a wife, but as something beyond both. Her veil was gone, and her expression was unreadable. "Elijah Moore," she said softly, but her voice carried across the field. "This land has long been your kingdom. You ruled it with fear. You made it bleed. Today, it remembers you." The pastor stepped forward, trembling. "Mrs. Moore, please. Let the law handle this." Margaret's gaze cut through him like glass. "The law?" she said coldly. "The law dined at our table. The law prayed in our parlor while the fields cried in silence." She turned to Elijah. You wanted the world to see you as a god. Now they will, and they'll see what kind of god you were. The men forced Elijah to his knees, his body shaking. His eyes darted between the crowd and his wife. Margaret, please, he whispered. You can't. But she could. Margaret raised her hand, and the crowd parted. From the rows of onlookers stepped Martha, the old housekeeper, carrying a wooden box. She opened it slowly. Inside lay the whip. Not a new one, but the same tool Elijah had wielded countless times. Its leather was stained dark, the handle worn smooth by his own hand. Margaret took it and held it out toward him. You taught pain as obedience, she said quietly. Now you'll learn what obedience feels like. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one dared move. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared, unable to look away. The first strike came not from Margaret, but from Martha. The sound cracked through the air like thunder. Elijah gasped, his body jerking. Another followed, and another, not out of rage but precision, as if the rhythm itself was part of something ancient and deliberate. Each strike echoed off the fields, mingling with the rising hum of voices, low, steady, powerful. The workers had begun to sing the hymn again, the same one that had haunted Margaret's dreams. Blood remembers. The earth takes back its name. Justice walks where chains once lay. The chant grew louder. The townsfolk, pale and trembling, began backing away, but the field hands stood firm. For once, the lines of fear and power were reversed. Margaret stepped forward, her voice soft but commanding. Do you hear it, Elijah? The hymn of those you silenced. You can't drown it this time. Elijah sobbed. Please, Margaret, stop. But there was no mercy left in her heart. Only truth. By the 10th strike, his back was a mess of welts and blood. The sight was horrifying. Yet there was no satisfaction in her eyes, only exhaustion. She looked not at him, but at the sky, whispering, Let this place be clean. Finally, she dropped the whip. Silence fell again. The hymn faded into a hum that lingered in the air like smoke. Margaret turned to the crowd. You came to watch judgment. You've seen it. Remember it, and never again bow to a man who feeds on pain. The crowd began to disperse, shaken, wordless. Some cried. Some simply turned away, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. Elijah collapsed beside the post, barely breathing. Margaret looked down at him one last time. You wanted them to watch your greatness, she whispered. Now they'll only remember your fall. Then she walked away, barefoot through the mud, leaving behind the man who had once ruled over everything and now ruled over nothing. That night, the skies broke open again. Thunder rolled endlessly as rain poured down on Moorfield Plantation, washing blood into the soil. But beneath that storm, in the fields that had seen centuries of suffering, something strange began to grow. Not just crops, but peace. And deep in the shadows of the barn, the candles still burned, waiting for what would come next. Because punishment was only the beginning. The true reckoning had not yet arrived. The townspeople gathered in the square under the pale light of the moon. The plantation owner stood before them, stripped of all dignity and dressed in his shame. The whispers of the crowd swelled into a murmur of disbelief as the wife, her white gown now stained with the red dust of vengeance, appeared on the wooden stage. In her hand, she held the whip that once echoed through the plantation's fields, the same whip her husband had used on the men he called slaves. Tonight, she said softly, her voice carrying through the still air, we unlearn what power means. The crowd fell silent. Behind her, the 3 men, the slaves her husband had taken to his bed, stood in a line, their faces unreadable. One of them, Thomas, met her eyes for a moment. There was no hatred there, only a tired understanding. The wife turned to her husband, his eyes wide, his hands bound. You brought them pain in the name of desire, she continued. You brought me shame in the name of privilege. Tonight, the world will remember what shame feels like. She handed the whip to Thomas. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thomas dropped it to the ground. We don't become him, he said, His voice was deep and calm, carrying through the hush of the crowd. The wife looked at him, her chest rising and falling with emotion. "Then what should become of him?" she asked. Thomas stepped forward. "Let him live with the weight of what he's done," he said. "Let him watch as everything he owned is freed from his grasp. His fields, his servants, even his own name." The crowd began to murmur again, some in agreement, others in anger. The wife turned to them. "You all watched," she said, her voice trembling. "You watched him take, and you stayed silent. You too will carry this." A cold wind swept through the square, rustling the torches. The plantation owner fell to his knees, his body shaking. The men who once served him now stood taller, as if the chains of the past had been lifted. Then, from the edge of the square, the old priest spoke. His voice cracked with fear. "Vengeance belongs to the Lord," he warned. The wife turned slowly toward him. "And where was your Lord when he made a mockery of us?" she asked, her words heavy with grief. No one answered. The silence was broken only by the flickering sound of the torches. She raised her hand toward the mansion on the hill. "Burn it," she said. The people hesitated, until Thomas picked up a torch and walked toward the house. One by one, others followed. Within minutes, orange light filled the night as the great plantation, a symbol of greed and power, began to burn. The wife stood in the square, her eyes reflecting the flames. Her husband screamed, pleading, but she turned away. His voice blended with the roar of the fire, the sound of collapsing wood, and the cries of the night creatures fleeing from the inferno. As dawn broke, only ashes remained. The fields were gray and quiet, smoke rising like ghosts into the morning air. The wife stood among the ruins, barefoot and still. "You said you owned everything," she whispered to the wind. "Now you own nothing, not even your name." From behind her, Thomas approached. "What happens now?" he asked. She looked at him, the first tears she'd allowed herself slipping down her cheeks. "Now," she said softly, "we learn what freedom costs." But as the smoke cleared, something strange happened. A sound echoed through the empty plantation grounds. A deep, hollow laughter that didn't belong to any living soul. Thomas froze. "Did you hear that?" The wife nodded, her face pale. The sound came again, closer this time. In the charred remains of the mansion, amid the ashes, the voice of the plantation owner, or something that wore his voice, whispered, "You can burn the house, but not the curse." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of blood and smoke. The wife turned slowly toward the blackened ruins, her heart pounding. Somewhere in the shadows, something moved. The ruins of the plantation smoldered for days. By the third morning, the smoke had turned gray, curling in thin wisps that rose toward the sky like broken prayers. The wife walked through the ashes barefoot, her white dress now blackened at the hem. Every step she took made a soft crackle underfoot. Burned wood, bone, and something else she couldn't name. The others had left. The crowd dispersed after the fire, whispering about the ghostly laughter that had echoed through the night. Only Thomas remained, watching her from a distance. "You should rest," he said softly. "I can't," she replied, kneeling beside what used to be the grand staircase. "He's still here." Thomas frowned. "You saw the fire. Nothing could have survived that." She looked up at him. "Not his body," she said. "His will." That night, the first sign came. The townspeople who had helped burn the mansion began to dream of the same thing. A man standing in the smoke, calling their names one by one. In the dreams, he was smiling, his eyes pale and hollow. When they woke, they found soot on their hands, and the smell of burnt wood in their homes. By the fourth night, whispers filled the town again. Chickens were found dead in their coops, their bodies arranged in strange patterns. Cows refused to move toward the pastures near the old plantation. And the church bell, which had rusted years ago, began ringing by itself at midnight. The wife stayed in a small cottage at the edge of the property. She wrote in her journal by candlelight, recording every strange occurrence. "He is trying to return," she wrote, "not in flesh, but in spirit. The fire did not destroy him. It set him free." Thomas came to her door just before dawn. "They're blaming you," he said. "The town thinks you brought a curse upon them." She set down her pen. "Then let them believe," she murmured. They always believed his lies. Now they can live with the truth. But even she began to doubt herself when she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping in the walls of the cottage. Every night, just before she fell asleep, the same sound returned. Tap, 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 like footsteps in the ashes. On the 6th night, she woke to find footprints, black and burned, leading from her doorway to her bedside. The air smelled like smoke and iron. Her heart hammered as she whispered, "Who's there?" The candle flickered violently, then went out. A voice rose from the darkness. Not a shout, not a whisper, but something in between. "Did you think you could erase me?" it said. She screamed and stumbled back, her hands clutching at the empty air. But the room was empty again. The footprints, however, remained, burned into the wooden floor. Thomas arrived moments later, his face pale as he saw them. "It's him," she said, trembling. "He's bound to this land." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we end it, for good this time." They returned to the ruins together that night. The moon was low, casting long, thin shadows across the field. The remains of the mansion stood like the skeleton of a memory. At the center of the ruins lay the old iron cross that once hung above the fireplace. The wife picked it up, its edges still warm. "He built this place on sin," she said. "We'll bury it under truth." They dug into the ash-covered soil until dawn. As the first light of morning touched the horizon, Thomas whispered a prayer. The wife pressed her hand to the earth. But just as she did, a tremor shook the ground beneath them. A crack split the soil, and a gust of burning wind erupted from below. Thomas fell back, shielding his face. The wife stared into the fissure and saw eyes staring back. Two pale, hollow eyes, burning in the darkness. She screamed and tried to pull away, but a charred hand shot up from the ground, gripping her wrist with impossible strength. Thomas lunged forward, pulling her free as the hand crumbled into ash. The fissure closed, the earth swallowing the last of the light. They collapsed on the ground, gasping. The wife turned to Thomas. "He's not dead," she whispered. "He's waiting." Thomas looked toward the horizon, his expression grim. "Then the curse isn't over," he said. "It's only beginning." As dawn broke, the smoke rose once again. But this time, it carried faces within it. Faces of those who had watched, those who had burned, and those who had stayed silent. The wind carried a single word through the trees, a word that chilled them both to the bone: justice. The dawn that followed was colorless. The fields surrounding the ruined plantation were blanketed in mist so thick that even the sun seemed hesitant to rise. The wife stood at the edge of the scorched land, her hands trembling as she held the charred iron cross. Every sound, the rustling grass, the creak of the wind, felt wrong, like echoes from another world. Thomas joined her quietly, his face drawn from sleepless nights. "The town's turning on us," he said. "They think we've brought this evil here." She looked out toward the blackened house. "It was already here," she replied. "We just gave it a name." They walked together into the remains of the great hall, where ashes swirled with every step. It smelled of smoke, old blood, and something else, something alive. The walls, half standing, pulsed faintly as if breathing. The wife whispered, "He's feeding on fear. The curse grows because they believe." Thomas knelt, brushing aside soot until he uncovered the stone foundation. Symbols had been carved there. Not Christian symbols, but older ones, circles intertwined with lines like chains. "He was part of something darker," Thomas said. "He didn't build this place alone." Before she could respond, the sound of horses echoed in the distance. The townspeople were coming, torches in hand, shouts of accusation filling the air. The wife turned toward the noise, her eyes calm now, resolved. "Then let them come. They will see the truth before the end." As the mob approached, the ground beneath their feet began to shake again. The fissure from the night before split open, this time wider, glowing red from within. Screams erupted as the townspeople stumbled backward. A wind howled through the ruins, carrying voices, his voice, whispering their names. Thomas grabbed her arm. "We have to run." She shook her head. "No, this is what he wants, fear. If I flee, he wins." She raised the cross high. "He built this curse through pride and possession. I'll end it through surrender." The wind grew louder, the whispers turning into laughter. Out of the fissure rose a black figure, smoke wrapping around it like a cloak. Its face was almost human, almost. "You took everything from me?" the voice rasped. "Now, I take everything from you." The wife stepped forward, her dress whipping in the wind. "You already did. There's nothing left to take but my soul, and you can't have it." The creature lunged toward her, its shadow stretching across the ruins. She thrust the iron cross into the air, and for an instant the world went still. Light, white, blinding, and pure, burst from the ground beneath her feet. The scream that followed was not human. The shadow recoiled, writhing as it was dragged back into the earth. The fissure sealed shut with a deafening crack, sending a shockwave through the valley. When the silence returned, the wife lay motionless on the ground. Thomas knelt beside her, his heart breaking. Her face was peaceful, almost serene. The iron cross, melted and twisted, rested in her open palm. The townspeople stood frozen, their torches dimming in the cold morning air. Thomas looked up at them, his voice trembling. "She saved you," he said. "Don't ever forget what your silence cost." Days passed. The earth healed, the ashes settled, and grass began to grow where the mansion once stood. The curse, it seemed, had lifted. But at night, when the wind passed through the valley, it carried a faint sound, a woman's voice, singing a hymn too old for anyone to remember. Thomas built a small wooden cross at the center of the field. On it, he carved a single word, deliverance. Years later, travelers who passed by the old plantation site spoke of a strange light that appeared over the land every full moon. Some said it was the wife's spirit watching over the free souls she had redeemed. Others swore they still heard the laughter of the plantation owner, faint and bitter, buried deep beneath the soil. One thing, however, was certain: no one ever built there again. And on stormy nights, when thunder rolled through the valley and lightning struck the fields, the shadows on the ground seemed to twist into the shape of two figures, one in white, one in black, locked forever in the endless dance between power and redemption. For in the ashes of vengeance, something darker than sin still slept, waiting for another name, another prideful soul, to awaken it again.